Hello, and welcome to Poetry Soundbite, a new series of poetry readings and interviews available at AIOTB magazine. There you can see it. I'm Chase Dimmick, the managing editor of AIOTB magazine, proud to host our third installment of the series with our guest today, Kory Wells. In a quick and tidy 30 to 45 minutes, we will learn a little bit about Kory, hear some of her poems, and explore how she crafts her work. Our poem selections and questions came from my students in my Intro to Poetry class at College of the Canyons, who are helping me put together these interviews as part of our Living Poet project. I thought this would be a cool way to teach poetry as a living, vital art form and encourage participating in the poetry community by meeting real, live poets. So that brings us to our living poet for today, Kory Wells. So here's a little bit of introduction about her. So Kory Wells is the author of Sugar Fix from Terrapin Books, a former software developer now focused on her longtime side gig in creative writing. Kory nurtures connection and community through her advocacy for the arts, afternoon naps, democracy, and other good causes. A recent two-term poet laureate of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, she is the founder and manager of a reading and open mic series and a mentor with the low residency program at MTSU, so Middle Tennessee State?
Yes.
MTSU, right. Kory's poetry has been featured on the Slowdown podcast by former U.S. Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith, and her writing appears in James Dickey Review, Ruminate, Stirring, the Southern Poetry Anthology, and elsewhere. And you can learn more about her at korywells.com. So thank you, Kory, for coming on to our show today. How are you doing?
I am doing great. And I just so appreciate the opportunity, Chase, to be able to read a few poems and talk about poetry, and just this idea that poetry is alive and that there are a lot of people who pursue it as a form of creativity and really joy, I think. And I think there's a question coming up maybe at some point about rejection and so forth. And so we'll get into the non-joyful part of it. But mostly, again, it just is that the delight of thinking about things and delving into what interests you.
Yeah, that's the part that I've loved the most as I've grown as a writer myself, is the aspect of community. Because when I teach poetry, and I've been teaching for 12 years now, oftentimes it feels like here's old poems in the past and poetry is like dead, or it's a historical piece encased in glass. But not only is it alive, you can be a part of it. You can be a participant. You don't even have to write poetry if you don't want to. You can simply be a fan.
Right.
And in this day and age of social media, you can follow people on Twitter. You're on Twitter, right?
Yes, I am.
We can follow you on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. This is not old books in a vault. These are living people that you can talk to and be a part of this community. Yeah. It's really exciting.
And who are really engaging, I think, often on some very vital topics as well. A poem can be about anything. And the ones that I'm going to share today are particularly related to the intersection of personal history and our United States history and so forth. But there's so many poets who are also writing about climate change and democracy and racial issues and identity. And it's just such a wonderful way to, again, interact on all those subjects.
Absolutely. And that's why when I was putting this series together, I thought about you, and you're right there on the top of my list, because what I loved about your work is the way that it engages history and our social climate today, specific to the region and culture in which you've lived and grown up in the South, that you're both engaging the past, which is a difficult thing to do in Southern history. Right. How do you disentangle the difficult elements from the parts that still, these are your ancestors, this is where you grew up. How do you take the good out of the bad history? Right. And I think your poetry does that in a way that doesn't let the past off the hook. And I think that's important, is that it doesn't I can feel a certain nostalgia for your family and your
Right,
relatives
right, of
and
course.
all the wonderful food in Sugar Fix. But you also don't let off the hook the past that created this region, created this culture, you know, kind of like in a, you're like Faulkner, but with more pies.
Well, I'll take that.
So anyway, so why don't we get started so we can get through all of your poems because you got 6 to present for us today. So let's start with the first 2 poems, Untold Story, and then All Things Are a Darkness. And then we have a question from a student.
All right, sounds great. Thank you. Untold Story. She was religious about reading aloud. Ann Lander's advice in the Free Press, Jell-O salad recipes in Good Housekeeping, letters and postcards from cousins, and one odd relation all the way in Australia. But neither of us ever said a word about the National Enquirer, which she'd pick up in the Winn-Dixie checkout next to the gum and chocolate bars, as if it were essential as milk and sugar. Back from the grocery on a summer afternoon, she'd start supper and I'd slip away to the overwarm sanctuary of her modest living room. Thin floral carpet, knotty pine walls, and a nubby mauve sofa where I, a sensitive and impressionable child, would spread the tabloid and kneel before it to absorb cover to cover and back again until my knees ached, the gospel of my disbelief. A moon landing hoax, an alien abduction, a 2-headed motherless kitten nursing a domesticated squirrel, and of course, the secret lives of stars. What is it that makes us want to swallow a story whole, to think only one version can be true? We were not true disciples, but my grandmother tended the altar of narrative possibilities. This woman with an 8th grade education, who I never saw reading a book. Thanks.
And you can find that poem on As It Ought to Be.
Yes, and of course that is about my grandmother, and she really did have only an 8th grade education, although my mother would want you to know that she did read books, but of course not when I was staying with her in the summertime. She was always busy. But that National Enquirer was maybe the original fake news, you know, way before the internet. And this next poem is also inspired by my grandmother and the stories that she would tell me. And the title is called All Things Are a Darkness, which is a phrase in a James Dickey poem. James Dickey being a fairly famous Southern writer who I love. Days when the house was empty, everyone in the fields but us kids. The granny woman from down the way would appear on our porch. She smelled of soot and sour milk, but most of all, ham biscuits. We'd let her in. After our bellies were full, she'd lure us behind the door, show us how to charm a stream of milk from an axe handle. Nights, a demon wildcat scratched and howled on our tin roof, fierce as a hailstorm, while the worthless dogs shivered and whined. And then there were our trips home late from town. At sundown, sudden figures would appear in our wagon bed, black-robed, faceless, weighing us down, so the mule team frothed to pull us free across that haunted bridge. Truth can be rough or polished. Like a hickory handle, these tales wear a smidgen thinner, shinier with each use. Now at the old home place, daylight leaks through cracks in the clapboards wider than before. In each room, a bare bulb swings, opaque as memory on a charged string, a corpse. Now in all the house, only a ratty feather tick, the cold cook stove, and yet smell of fresh biscuits, clatter of pail. Want is the mother of belief. And what, my child, do you know of want? Of want for milk or second helpings, for new shoes or any shoes, for a tight house, a good roof, indoor plumbing, light after darkness? To be 5 and wanting a doll, wanting your mother to wake from her too long sleep, wanting her voice to be real and anchored to her breathing body. I tell these stories in hopes you tremble, in hopes you realize something's coming always for your tender soul.
Excellent. Excellent. And I love your reading. You're like, this is the first time I've actually heard you read a poem aloud. And I love your performance. It's just so measure perfect. I also like the fact that you say poem the same way that Mike James does.
Yeah, I didn't even realize I said it differently than a lot of the world till fairly recently. And someone
Well, I mean,
commented, "Oh, I love
so
how you
far
say
in
that."
terms of
Like,
our
really?
guests, you're in the majority here. You and Mike James, that same
Yeah. And
pronunciation.
we have to say that Mike and I are nearly neighbors. You know, we live in the same town. So we, for the sake of your audience, that's an interesting little factoid, I think, that
So that's the Murfreesboro pronunciation,
you
poems.
got it. Yes.
So we got a question from student Alexis Steers, and they wrote, my favorite of your poems was All Things Are Darkness. The name alone was able to pull me into reading it, and I was glad I did. The zigzag structure of the piece made it feel as if it was spiraling, and that I was spiraling along with it. While this is probably just the way that I had read it, but as the poem moved, it felt like it was starting to get faster. And when I had reached the last line, it felt that it had suddenly stopped, like I had fallen off the bed during a nightmare and just hit the floor. Was this spiraling intentional for the writing? And when you write, do you put a lot of concentration toward the structure? Then also, the line that I got most attached to was tails wear a smidgen thinner, shinier with each use. Is this talking about how when stories are told in mass, they seem to lose their original value and gain a different kind, or is it something else? And wow, part of that question was a poem unto itself.
It is. There's so many wonderful observations in that. I really appreciate that, Alexis. Um, so to answer that first question about that line and the tails wear a smidgen thinner and shinier with each use, I do think that stories take on a life of their own when they are a true oral tradition of something that is passed down. And I do come from a storytelling tradition. It's, you figured that out.
It's
Even
obvious if
from,
you read your
yeah,
book.
from two poems, you know that. Um, and and a lot of these stories, you know, they have to change because our memory changes, and the facts that we individually may recall from an event, different things stand out to different people, and different things stand out to us at different points in our lives, I think. And that's part of what I mean. You know, some of these famous stories from my family, or infamous, are definitely morphing over time and with the perspective that each generation can bring to them. As far as the structure of this poem and this idea of spiraling, I really love that Alexis had that sensation. And I think of it, maybe not, maybe it does speed up. And Chase, you can tell me that, you know, when did you hear that when I was reading it?
Not so much with the pace of the reading, but definitely with the impact and speed with which ideas were hitting me, because it becomes more and more like a horror story toward the end.
Well, and I think that, yeah, I think that it's this intensity that starts piling on toward the end. And what's really interesting to me is that in the writing of this poem, I think I was doing these tercettes, the 3-line stanzas, simply because it just felt right. And I did the staggering to, you know, make it move around on the page a little bit more. I always do a fair amount of revising and trying to tighten things up because I'm a wordy poet anyway. And so I'm always trying to make things a little bit more concise. But it was also in discovering, I was thinking about, why did my grandmother tell me all these stories that just scared me to death. And a lot of these that are referred to in this particular poem, I thought were her real experiences. And it turns out that a lot of these are actually Appalachian folktales. Uh, I never knew that until I was, well into adulthood. But we also have a lot of real family stories that she passed down as well. But my grandmother's mother died when she was, I think, about 5 or 6 years old. And when I was writing this and thinking about why does my grandmother tell these stories to her kids and then to her grandkids, and there is this reality of life is hard, life is scary. Mm-hmm. And it was truly a discovery for me as I was writing this to be in my grandmother's body and be thinking about that day that her mother died and what that would be like. So
interesting. I like that. The idea of the transmission of storytelling, and when you're going to tell the story, the idea that you're kind of inhabiting the body of those who you heard it from, but you're also in your own body. So
yeah,
that definitely speaks to the way in which these stories evolve and change, especially to meet the times in which they're told.
exactly. Yeah.
So speaking a little bit about history, let's move on to the next two poems, Mahali Explains, and then The Assistant Marshal Makes an Error in Judgment, both which talk about the past into the 19th century and this very complicated, fraught history of the South that you talk about so just so thoughtfully and fairly, I think.
Thank you. So this first is Mahali Explains. And Mahali is one of my great grandmothers. And I imagine this is a story I imagine about why she stayed in the little part of North Georgia that she did when most of the Cherokee were removed on the Trail of Tears. So this has the epigraph from President Andrew Jackson in his rationale for the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And I actually think this is rather poetic, even though it's also quite tragic. By persuasion and force, they have been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain, until some of the tribes have become extinct and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible name. How else could I have made a life? My kin forced by soldiers from their homes, me left alone. When the neighbor came in the night, I braced against his rotten potato smell, the weak fire in his eyes for drink and lust. Even then, I'd known his temper, but I saw no other way to make a life. So I bore his ragged rhythm, pinning my mind on the dark locust, how its pale bloom shines gold in the day's last delight. He came to me that first night, drunk and wordless, with a shudder divining the cold way we'd be forever yoked. Both of us alone, no other way to make a life. I bore that Irishman child after child, my darkness on their skin, a cane flute's final note, ever ebbing. He kept coming in the night and named our sons for presidents. Jackson, the sharpest knife to my backbone. America, he said. Tennessee, I told myself I'd name our first girl. Small way to mark my life, my only peace in the constant coming of the night.
Wow. That's it. That's just an incredible piece.
Well, thank you. And so I do have women in my family who have the name Tennessee, and I have a lot of ancestors. The men all there are Andrew Jackson so-and-so and Millard Fillmore so-and-so.
Wow.
And I think, why were these people of mixed color named for, essentially their oppressors? And then you realize, well, they're trying to assimilate. And what better way to try to assimilate and say, oh, we're American, than to have, be named after American presidents. But
and And that fits in really well with the next poem too, because if you think about that, so many people that have lived in America, their only real trace we have is their name.
Yes.
And so this next one is about the census.
Mhm.
And yeah, going back to the idea of assimilation, at that point, if your name was just Millard Fillmore,
Right.
what evidence do we have going back to know who this person was and to realize that this was a person of indigenous heritage? It gets erased.
Right.
And so that's perfect for this next poem, because this is about the census and erasure.
Yes, it is. It is. And again, based on some actual family history, first stories that I was told about us having Native heritage, but then I have the actual proof from a census in 1870 that this is based on. And of course, it's all imagined as to exactly how this happened, but this is my imagining of that. The assistant marshal makes an error in judgment. From the 9th United States Census, June 18th, 1870, Macon County, North Carolina. Even though he has read and reread best he can the instructions sent direct from Washington, even though he employs a sturdy portable inkstand, quality ink he blots dry with unpracticed diligence on strictly confidential wide white sheets, even though important scientific results depend upon his questionable R's and too short L's, tedious recording of name, age, occupation, and color. Assistant Marshal J.T. Reeves, who some call carpetbagger, now sits amiably on the porch with one Willis Guy, farmer, age 59, and reads back to Mr. Guy all he has written, so mistakes may be corrected on the spot. The marshal is not from around these parts, and Mr. Guy, previously known as mulatto, previous to that known as free colored person, if asked, would claim Catawba, Cherokee, even the dark Portuguese, but figures it better to keep his silence at the government man's ditto of column 6. Like that, Mr. Guy and all his kin become white. Mr. Guy would admit he isn't as good at letters as his children, but squinting sideways at the marshal's ledger, he knows the unmistakable difference between W and M.
Wow. What I love about that poem is that it calls attention in one tiny way, one moment in history, a much larger history that defines our America in the 19th and 20th century, which is the way in which the bureaucratic recording and defining of these terms invented and also erased identities.
Yes.
And the way that you study it over time, what it meant to have a certain background changed, not based on what the people of that background felt or how they identified,
right,
but based on however the government was going to define it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to me when you look at that and you think that then they get down into percentages sometimes and say, if you're this percentage, this background, then the one drop rule says therefore,
Right.
And so that's something that we maybe overlook sometimes, is that how people literally got pushed into another place in America, not based on them or even their community, but based on what a bureaucrat from the federal government said is now the new definition of your identity.
That's right. That's
I could
right.
go on forever about this,
Yeah,
because I love your work, but I'm going to let my students do the questions here. And so we got 2 questions here. First one from Jennifer Morrow. And Jennifer wrote, I noticed some of your poetry is based on historically related circumstances or historically related stories, such as The Assistant Marshal Makes an Error in Judgment and Mahali Explains. Are you reading about things that prompt these poems? Do you choose a subject? Are they purposely crafted poems, or did you hear the start of them and go from there? When I write poetry, I hear the start and then get it on paper and then work on it more as I hear it. And then I'm going to ask Ariana's question as well. So Ariana Baker writes, I really like how this poem, and this one's The Assistant Marshal, tackles such a complex facet of racism and translates it into an experience that is easy to understand and empathize with. And I noticed that through much of the poem revolves around literacy and writing. I noticed its connotations were flipped from its normally positive associations and were used to highlight the assistant marshal's practical inexperience and naivety. I was wondering if this sense of irony and snark was something that you had kept in mind. There's a little snark, I think, implied there, in mind when initially writing, or is it something that developed later on in the editing process? So I know I just hit you with a lot, but
That was a lot. Yeah.
There's an entire term paper in those two questions.
Yeah. I'm going to work backwards then. And to start with Ariana's question about the snark. Yes, it was there from the beginning, because when you know the history and you look at this, the fact that this is 1870. So here in the South, this is the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. And at this point in time, the people who were sent from Washington to be census takers, rather than what would have been in the past, would have been local people for the most part. And so these were outsiders, and they were coming around, and someone who was local would have come to this family's house. And again, this is some of my family. They would have come to this family's house already knowing, oh, these are part of the Cherokee. They are part of the Catawba. But these were people who, because it was an outsider, he walks up to them, and guess what? Maybe they don't look completely native. And so he says, what are you? Or he actually doesn't say, what are you? He's just looking, and he decides they're white, and he writes that down. But everyone at that point in history, I shouldn't say everyone, but there's going to be a lot of people who were very resistant to these still Union sympathizers coming into the South to do anything, including taking the census. So that's where that snark kind of gets its origins from. On Jennifer's question, Chase, you may have to remind me what it is.
Sure, it's the about how you prompt the start of your question.
Yes, thank you. So some poems for me do come from an opening line or from a voice that suddenly is in my head. And so I start writing, and that remains, even after revision, that remains something that's very clear, is that voice has grabbed me. In the case of most of these poems that we're talking about today, because I had specific stories, specific narratives in mind that I wanted to tell, these took more experimentation to come up with, okay, how do I want to tell this story in a fairly compact way? And so, like originally, I don't think that the assistant marshal was in this story. I mean, I just wanted to capture how this family was mulatto in 1860 on the census, and then they became white in 1870. How does that happen? And so, there were different ways that I initially approached this before I decided, oh, it's the assistant marshal. He's really the key here. So,
and just just that the change of one letter, one person subjectively from outside making an observation based on their own internalized biases, puts one letter on one piece of paper, and suddenly you are a different human being in the eyes of your government and the world around you.
Right.
It tells us how much the nature of identity is important, and the power of being able to identify it for yourself instead of having some other more powerful entity putting you into a box on the census or in a file, and how identity changes over time.
Absolutely.
Like the history of whiteness in America, like what qualifies at how you define that term That's not a self-evident thing as you look at it over time.
Right.
And often it is redefined in different historical eras based on biases that the majority population has, but also the interests of people that are in power. You know, if we define some people some way, it helps the powerful in whatever their interests are. And it's interesting to see that therefore then people become defined as white and then not white and then white again over the course of American history. And it's something you don't think about too much, but yet it informs the world we live in today.
Yeah. And it absolutely informed, certain generations as far as their rights and their privileges and, the life choices that were available to them.
Sure.
So it's
to
tremendous.
define somebody as not, one of the things in American history is if you define somebody as non-white, that also meant taking away some privileges and some more point civil rights.
Yeah.
And that history is just fascinating. I like the fact that your poems work on that, on just this micro level of your experience. But your tiny experience is one that so many people have that little experience, and it adds up to understanding the history of these policies. So anyway, I could talk about this forever, but we got a couple more poems that I want to make sure that we got plenty of time to read and talk about. So the next one is going to be When the Watched Pot Boils.
Yes. When the watched pot boils, time is getting by, and you try to remember all she told you. Use both dark meat and white. Save bone and skin and gristle for the cat. Roll the dough thin as a paper sack. Slice it into strips no wider than your thumb. You'd give up sweets for a month to hold again her wood-handled knife, its old blade so often sharpened it was almost gone. You think of these things as you stand at the stove, the kettle's broth rolling. Think of the story she told. That time a door-to-door peddler tried to snatch her youngest. That hot night she and her lover broke every dish in the house. That Sunday, the kids ate their own pet rooster for lunch. Reminding you, chicken and dumplings need plenty of salt. You taste that name passed down to her, Tennessee, and she is with you, barefoot, stirring the pot, one eyebrow raised. That hard T, that soft S, the irony she was born in Georgia and lies now all too soon in Alabama soil. Some things are never right. Some things are not better with time. But maybe her name was perfect. After all, how many of the stories she told had a happy ending?
I know this is totally not what you were trying to get at with these poems, but the fact that it's Easter, and I know that I've got an Easter ham and scalloped potatoes waiting for me at my parents' house right now, like all the ham references and dumpling references are get me excited for this evening.
Well, and chicken and dumplings are particularly Christmas, but they are our special occasion meal. So yes, it's quite right for you to be thinking of your Easter dinner as well.
And I mean, and everything in your book, Sugar Fix, revolves around this idea of food as it's tied to these family and historical memories.
Yeah, most definitely. It's an important thing in our family. I mean, of course, food is I think probably a big part of most family gatherings, but particularly sugar is we're addicted. So I had to write that.
And I've read about how historians have looked at recipe books that have been passed down from generations as a source of history written by people that wouldn't necessarily have had their voices heard.
Yeah.
So like women in the domestic sphere writing not just the recipe, but there's also in the marginalia and the notes, insights and pieces of history that get recorded. So like in the food, in the recipe, there is a certain preservation of story there.
Yeah, there really is. There's a lot of interesting things to learn about, yeah, food ways and the stories behind those.
So,
Um,
and Jennifer picks up on that in her question, and she says, I really liked your poem, When the Watch Pot Boils, because that is how I feel when I see items from my mother or grandmother or several other relatives that remind me of time spent with them and the stories they told. Is this an actual memory of your mother, question mark, or is it a crafted poem? And what were the circumstances that prompted you to write this poem?
mm. Um, So these are mostly actual memories. I think there's probably a little bit of hyperbole um, in maybe the door-to-door peddler trying to snatch the youngest. But my mother told me stories of being just scared to death of this certain door-to-door peddler, so he had to make an appearance. But this is mostly memories of my grandmother. She taught me to make this chicken and dumplings, which is a really traditional dish for Southern Appalachian people. And so just making dumplings, going through that again, at a special time for a celebration or something, kind of made me start thinking about this. As terms of craft, though, I would say everything I work on is crafted, even though some of it may flow out pretty easily. There's still things that are going on in terms of deciding about line lengths and word choices that happen in revision to hopefully make the poem all it can be. And another thing that prompted this one, there's a poet named Dave Harity who's from Kentucky, and he has a poem in which he says, it starts out, try to remember what he taught. And I believe it's about his father. And I just love that prompt. Think of someone special and try to remember what what did that person teach you? And so where does that take you? And that's how this poem, in addition to just, making chicken and dumplings, that's how this poem came to be.
That's awesome. And yeah, I love that idea of the past, that there's both the passed down story and then there's also the I witnessed that story.
Yes.
But you also witness the passing down of the story to you. So there's this relationship between the preservation of what you've been given versus the experience of it and the interpretation and the how am I going to express this out, to the next listener.
Right. Yeah.
And food is a great way to do that insofar as it seems food seems to preserve the most of the experience. Like if you just say she made amazing apple pie, that says something to everybody that words would lose in translation.
And I think that kind of relates to, I know something I learned or heard in a fiction class once is even if you've got a very unlikable person, you show them eating, because eating is such a humane thing, and we all do. And so, not that I need to necessarily humanize my grandmother anymore, but there is something so visceral about eating and food and commonality about that, that I think for me, feels very.
Everybody eats.
Yeah.
That's like one of the few things you can actually think of as a universal experience is everybody has to eat. And I'd say 99.9% of people like to eat.
Yes. Yeah.
Or like some form of eating, or or in the very least, we all have a relationship to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't not get something out of that. So
right.
Anyway, I want to make sure we got plenty of time to go to the final poem and student questions as well. And this one is called As the Story Goes.
Yes. So, and this is, there's an epigraph that says after Vandana Khanna. And so she has a poem. I'll talk more a little bit after this about how her poem inspired this one. As the story goes. Before I was born in a city that loves the taste of marshmallow pies, a sign, a gypsy peddler jangling pans and fortunes, telling me to sing to move, to grow ever restless of the same view. My mother, nourished 9 months by Burger King, on the day of my birth ate an apple ripe as her small womb. She would need the doctor, curse his knife. My father, just back from service, all square shoulders and cleft chin, searched for the job that would keep him from us hours and holidays, swearing duty, food on the table. These facts melt warm and familiar as spun sugar on my tongue. But I started longer ago as a ship that lost its way, as the rain and muck of a wilderness trail, as the shelter of a cave, as a place called Sugar Fork, where bats at twilight once circled and swirled like Cherokee dancers, where against a sky darker than spent earth, stars float still like manna, a hope that never fell.
Awesome. So we had a couple of student questions for your final poem. One comes from Bella DC Solo, and she writes, when writing As the Story Goes, what was the inspiration that fueled the topic and what sparked the poem alive? So that's the beginning. And then Nicole Avendano asks, I noticed that the last stanza of the poem, As the Story Goes, you write, where against a sky darker than spent earth, stars float still like manna, a hope that never fell. I think this part of the piece is very beautiful and poetic. Could you explain more about what it means? So
Sure.
I guess it's the what started it and why did you end it the way you ended it?
Yeah, all right. Both great questions. So the start really refers back to where I have this epigraph on the poem. Vandana Khanna has a poem in her book called Afternoon Masala is the book. She has a poem called Insignificant Beginnings. And the poem is about the same length as this one. And it starts out, before I was born in a country that loves the sound of vowels. And then she goes on and she describes what's going on with her mother, what's going on with her father, and some clues as to her origins, which are in the country of India. And I was just so taken with that poem. And for me, it sounded very exotic, you know. What is exotic? Well, partly it's just what is unfamiliar. But then so I'm born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That's where I'm from. Now, how poetic is Chattanooga? You know, maybe not. And I think, well,
how do you have the Chattanooga Choo Choo?
Well, yeah, you do.
It had a famous song from like what, 100 years ago?
Yes. Pardon me.
Just saying it's possible.
Okay, we're not even going to go there, Chase. I'll start singing it. But I'm thinking, well, if I were going to tell a story of my beginnings, and I was going to kind of make it as romantic or exotic as possible, but still follow that rough outline of how Vandana does her poem, well, how do I start? What do I say? And so for me, it was thinking, oh, well, Chattanooga is the home of the moon pie. Chase, do y'all have moon pies out in LA?
Oh, we got moon pies out here.
Okay.
Yes, so, I'm well aware of the moon pie.
Okay. So moon pies are made in Chattanooga, but I didn't really want a trademarked name. But a marshmallow pie, a city that loves the taste of marshmallow pies. And so that got me rolling. And of course, again, quite a bit of food shows up in this poem as well. To get to the ending, so the place called Sugar Fork is a real place that, again, I identified from when I was doing genealogy and research on my family. So they really came from a little community. And isn't that wonderful that I'm writing about sugar and they were good enough to have actually lived at a place called Sugar Fork? I mean, you cannot ask for any better. But the rest of that ending, particularly the last stanza, where against a sky darker than spent earth. Well, the spent earth is the fact that back in this time, so they're subsistence farmers. That's how they're making a life, a living. And at that time, they wouldn't have known to rotate crops. And they actually exhausted their lands. And I have some uh, documentation of a letter in which someone is writing on their behalf to say, hey, there's these native folks who are living here. They did not go on the Trail of Tears. They didn't go to Oklahoma. They're having a really, really hard time making a living now. Their lands are exhausted. And so that spent earth is referring to that. But then, me, I have to end on something hopeful. So I'm imagining that such as the manna in the Christian tradition that fed the people when there was nothing else for the people, that maybe that manna is up there in the heavens, and the hope is always there. So that's my Pollyanna ending, I'm afraid, but.
But I also like that as a biblical allusion, that it's also that your work is also looking at the multi levels of religion and cultural mythology that populate our country, and not necessarily privileging one over the other, despite the fact that sometimes our country has a history of doing that.
Right. Yeah.
That there's multi voices speaking. And especially since so many of the subjects, the historical figures and people that you've known or in your family or ancestors have more than one historic, more than one ethnic background, more than one cultural background, perhaps even then more than one religious background.
Right. Certainly spiritual background, one would assume. Yeah.
And I think that's part of looking at America for what it actually is, instead of some kind of ideology or romanticized background or ideal, but saying that this is how many people lived, composed of many different cultural constituent elements, without. And what I like is also you don't try to say, okay, to define or pigeonhole these people, because a lot of these subjects defy that, and that's a good thing.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to, since you did bring it up at the very, very beginning, we got maybe a minute or two. I'm always pushing the time constraints on here, but you brought up the idea of being rejected.
Oh, yes.
Bella asked, what's the hardest part about being a published poet? Does the rejection of a poem occur often? So I think she's maybe implying that rejection might be the hardest part. I personally don't think it is, but what do you think?
Yeah. So as a newer poet, I think that I did take rejection a little bit harder. But it is something that you do just have to absolutely say, that's the way the system works. And you have to put work out there, and you hopefully have to find the journals where they do have a sensibility toward your type of writing, and that's going to set you up for a little bit more success. But yeah, rejection really doesn't bother me anymore. You just have to be matter of fact about the fact that, I don't know about you, Chase, in your experience, but I mean, I consider like a 10% acceptance rate to be good, which is a 90% rejection rate.
Yeah, I did the math on my submittable page.
Yeah,
and I'm at 11%.
Yeah.
So I'm exceeding your expectations.
There you go.
Yeah. I mean, so that means once you've even found your voice and you're kind of in your zone for what you write, it's still going to be a 1 in 10 thing.
Yes.
And I'm personally I agree with you. Earlier on, it was a thing. Now it's just, when I get that note in my inbox, it's just a casual wonder. No, okay.
That's right.
Because it's not because you're not good or the piece isn't good. You have to understand that hundreds and hundreds of people send submissions. And so it's just not what they were looking for, or other people were what they were looking for, or there's just a myriad of reasons for that. And
Right.
none of them are the you suck.
Right. No,
That's
absolutely.
not the right
No.
message to take from a rejection, even if it's a 2-sentence form rejection. It's just, this wasn't the piece for the time.
That's right. That's right. And if you do get, I mean, sometimes you'll get that this isn't for us, but we really admired this. We would like to see more of your work. Those types of things I think are wonderful. They're a little extra bonus, even if you didn't get an acceptance. And you should always follow those up. If somebody says we'd like to see more of your work, then you need to send things to them again. But yeah, it's.
Sometimes the form rejection isn't because they didn't want to see it. It's because they got 1,000 submissions.
They're overwhelmed.
And nobody's getting paid for this.
No.
So, you just, they click the, well, we're sorry, but we know you worked your hardest, but this just isn't for us.
Right.
Yeah, I would definitely say that maybe the first year it was difficult, but at this point, it is just part of the game, and you accept that I'm not going to please everybody all the time with my work.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just too much good work out there, which brings me to
so much good poetry.
Yes. And so that's the importance of community. And the fact that you find the community that's interested in swapping poems with you, reviewing, reading each other's poems, critiquing poems, really coming to care for what happens to, your critique partners' poems and what they're trying to say. And you become a better poet by helping others in a peer-to-peer relationship. So that's the other thing that I would strongly urge, besides just being creative in any way that you can, that your students can. And that is, if they want to write poetry, find people to be in a small group with, to swap work with. And that sense of community is just so much an important part of me being a poet and enjoying the process.
Yeah, that's my favorite part too. I mean, in fact, I enjoy that more than the actual having written and published poems. The most meaningful part is that a poem is actually just my ticket to hang out in the community.
That's right.
You get to go to it's fun to read your poem at a reading, but it's more fun. The fun part is actually just being there.
Yeah, being
participant there. And you don't have to write poems to be a participant in the community.
Right.
You can be a fan. Trust me, we
like fans.
We're looking for fans. We got books to sell here.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, listening to each other is a gift. And that's such the reason to be, Zooming with each other to do poetry, or showing up at live events when we can do that again. We don't listen to each other enough. And that's something we get to practice. And
I love that.
Important.
Poetry is listening. That's awesome. So, okay, I've bent my rules again. This was supposed to be a 30-minute show. It never is. But anyway, thank you so much to our guest, Kory Wells, for reading all of her poems, and especially to my students from my Intro to Poetry class for their fantastic questions. We'll have at least 2 more poets coming up next month, Agnes Forsta and John Dorsey. I'm looking forward to hearing from them. But for now, thanks again to Kory Wells, and I'll see you in the next edition.
Thank you, Chase, and thank your students so much as well. Great questions.
And thank you.